years. Okay, we realized that we had a problem back in '85, started doing some stuff, but it was not enough. So, you know, this is when the National Guide to Sustainable Municipal Infrastructure got support and got created. This is where we had colleagues like Saeed Mirza from the University of McGill that started doing reports on Canada's infrastructure crisis and the causes of that crisis. This is where the Canada Infrastructure Works program was extended because it was such a good program. We had at the same time the National Water and Wastewater Benchmarking Initiative that started. This is an award-winning benchmarking initiative that has been running since about 1997. Then we get into the new millennium. And this is where things start maybe changing. In the early 2000, we again had continuation of new programs. So this is just, you know, extracted from the Treasury Board Secretariat of Canada, and you see that, well, you know, it was such a good program, we have it until 2014. And then there was, you know, at that time, after a few years of begging and getting on our knees funding for this InfraGuide project. Again, around those years, there was the, now really the future of infrastructure in Canada starting to be on the radar screen of many, many organizations, including the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and in September 2002, Reg was part of it, creating a guide to sustainable asset management to Canadian municipalities. So this was not a technical guide. This was, you know, for elected officials, educating elected officials. But while all that was doing, then this infrastructure deficit continued to grow. So a group of organizations got together and in 2003 created the Civil Infrastructure Systems Technology Roadmap. You know, again, somebody mentioned that we're engineers, so we have to do things one, you know, a certain way. I think it was Rice that was saying for ISO, well, we're engineers, we have to have a roadmap. And we don't like to ask directions. We want to know direction ahead of time. So this was a group of organizations that got together and said, where are we going? And since we're engineers, we're going to look at it from the technology point of view. Except that when we got to the end of this exercise, we realized, well, technology is only a small part. We need to have legal, we need to have educators, we need to have a whole bunch of people participate in that discussion because alone engineering is not going to do it. And it was, therefore, an invitation to action, and you can see the handsome young man there. That, no comment on the rest of my sentence. And so where do we go from there out of the technology roadmap? We have a direction. We know where we're going. Well, there was this organization that got together with about 20 or 25 association organizations that attempted to create a national roundtable on sustainable infrastructure. It just was the wrong title. You know, I think that we're you know, technical people, and we say, oh, that's a great idea, national roundtable. Well, it just happened that this was not the proper timing to call something a roundtable. We could have called it a square table and maybe it would have flown, but you know, it just wasn't the proper timing. But the network was there, the people were there. There was also a group called the National Asset Management Working Group, NAMWAG. So you know, we're bad at acronyms. The National Roundtable on Sustainable Infrastructure, that NERTC. So we had a NERTC and NAMWAG. That doesn't roll well on the tongues of parliamentarians. So, but this organization, NAMWAG, created an asset management governance framework for Canada. Again, it was bringing people together. So those years were mobilization and years where we got all different types of organizations. This NAMWAG, for example, and NERTC were not engineering groups. There were engineers and planners and finance officers and accountants and various levels of government and so on. They were really multidisciplinary, multi-sector. So meanwhile, well, the InfraGuide died, and died of a painful death, and because there was no more money, but he still created 55 best practices. and it had about 350 volunteers. But then the spirit of InfraGuide keeps on living because a number of organizations decided, you know, the networks are so important for our organizations. So we're going to create organizations like, or associations like, or partnerships like CNAM, the Canadian Network of Asset Managers, like Asset Management BC. Now we have Asset Management Saskatchewan, and I'm told that we're going to have Asset Management Alberta pretty soon. So this is the network. The networks have remained strong. The people need to have these connections, and not only amongst engineers or technical people, with other professions, because they're all involved in delivering infrastructure. And we had, you know, our own GASB 34 or whatever regulations in terms of accounting you have in New Zealand and Australia and so on. We call it, you know, PS 3150, and basically suddenly we realized that the accountants did in 3 years what we were been trying to do for 15 or 20 years as engineers. But, you know, at one point, you know, you realize that you have to evolve and you have to work on what exists, and suddenly we realize now that we can work with the results of PS 3150. So, you know, the question that we ask ourselves is, are we there yet? You know, it's been a long journey. We started in, you know, some of us in the 1990s, and you know, we see progress. We see progress because for about a month ago, I was at a meeting where there were 3 Ontario ministers, and they each at least said asset management twice in their speeches when they're talking about infrastructure. So you know, we have this, as I mentioned, we have these groups, associations, Asset Management BC and Saskatchewan. And so where are we going now? And we're in 2012. We are in Canada going to be producing, or we have produced, but it's not released yet, a National Infrastructure Report Card, which is based on what we have learned from other countries. From, you know, Australia have their own, UK have their own, the US have their own, and we kind of learned from what they did and developed this process. So that is coming, and you know, before the fall, hopefully, you know, that will be released. But you have to put everything in the context, and this is where it becomes complex, because in 2014 is going to be a critical year for infrastructure in Canada. All these nice programs that we've been talking about, the Building Canada Fund and so on, big chunk of that funding expires in 2014. So the federal government has to renegotiate and decide, you know, how are they going to continue those programs. In 2014 as well, there is the renegotiation of what we call the Health Accord. And the Health Accord is, you know, agreements between the federal government and the provinces on how much money the federal government is going to give to the provincial governments for health. So now in 2014, what you get is that you get the competition between infrastructure and health. Okay? So let me say, infrastructure and health. So, you know, this is our you know, headlines out of our latest budget. You know, very few surprises. There's nothing is going to be really announced until 2014, and then hopefully we'll have a better balance, because otherwise infrastructure is going to be, again, the poor, you know, cousin in the whole federal funding. So that kind of gives you an overview of what's been happening in Canada in terms of infrastructure. So I hope that kind of generates some discussion. Thank you very much.
I'd like to invite our other panelists, if they could please take a chair in the front here. We're going to bring Rise back. There you are. And we're going to just take a bit of time to have a bit of discussion. And just before we start, I'm going to allow the panelists an opportunity to allow the Rise, would you prefer to see the audience or to see the panel? Oh, Hang on. Try it again. We didn't hear you.
Sorry, you didn't hear me because I've muted myself. I said probably the audience, if that's where the questions are coming from.
Sorry, audience? Okay, we'll just get that set up. So, panelists, rise included. I want you to just think about what you heard from each other. We've had a very interesting journey around the world, I would suggest, listening to the immense growth activities and infrastructure that are going on in China. Found Korea quite interesting in the sense of a lot of similarities of challenges that we face in Canada. I found that quite interesting. Perspective in New Zealand, Australia, where we see them as leaders. Perspective on resilience was an interesting one, obviously because of current affairs that are going on there. The international standard development process that RISE provided to us and issues going on in the UK. Bill's a very interesting perspective on sustainability with respect to infrastructure and the journey of process that you saw in Guy's presentation. A wide variety, and I didn't really put any clamps on these guys in terms of what they wanted to speak about. I thought let them say what they wanted to say, and I knew there would be a sort of a potpourri of information that came forward. We'll try to knit that together with a bit of dialogue and discussion and questions. I'm assuming you have certain questions that maybe came through as you were listening. I hope you remembered them. The time is long from some of the earlier speakers, but I'm going to open first to the panel in terms of any interaction, reaction, questions, and dialogue between each other to start the process.
Well, I have an observation and a question. First, the observation is interesting. We know, for example, we have various speakers here from what I would call mature infrastructure countries. So the UK, New Zealand, Australia, US, Canada, where the level of maturity we're not so much into the growth of infrastructure as opposed to having to deal with the problems of maintaining our existing infrastructure. On the other hand, we have South Korea, we have China, India was mentioned, we're talking about Brazil, where it's a boom of infrastructure. And if you look at the period that these countries are developing their infrastructure, and look at when we developed our infrastructure, which was about between 55 and 70, 1955 and 1970, this is where the major booms of infrastructure. Now they're doing the same from 1995 to 2000 and beyond. I'm wondering if there is within, for example, South Korea or China, a certain thinking about once we build it, how are we going to be able to maintain all that infrastructure from long term, not just we're building it and we'll see what happens later.
Yeah, in terms of some maintenance, because as you told me, so we spend a lot of money during the 1990 until the 2000s, but right now we're trying to reduce some in terms of some funding, so it is